Let us begin with a story, one that many of you may recognize within yourself. A man recalls, "There was a weekend when I endured the company of guests who overstayed far beyond my invitation. Their presence drained me, yet I met them with patience, with courtesy, with the discipline of civility. When at last they departed, I felt an immense wave of relief. I believed my endurance, my restraint, had earned me a reward. So I went to a nursery to buy something lovely, a small beauty for my garden. And then, almost without warning, I picked a quarrel with the nurseryman, humiliating myself in the process. In truth, it was not the nurseryman I quarreled with, it was the shadow part of myself I had ignored. Since I did not meet it consciously, I projected it onto a stranger. Balance was achieved, but clumsily, destructively, stupidly. What we learn here is crucial. The shadow within us demands recognition. It is not an intruder, it is part of who we are. If you do not own it, you will cast it upon another unsuspecting soul. The shadow will always insist on its portion, whether it comes out with intelligence or in foolishness. Projection is far easier than assimilation, but projection only breeds conflict. If you wish to live your life with dignity, with grounded awareness, you must acknowledge that other dimension within you, the dark, the unrefined, the denied. Understand this, every human being carries the potential for evil, not just others. You too. To deny it is to invite it in through the back door. Refuse your shadow, and you collect poison. That poison may later show itself as depression, psychosomatic illness, accidents that appear random but carry unconscious intent. The psyche stores what you refuse, and it will burst through in some unwanted form. And here is the larger truth. We are not just dealing with individual shadows today. We suffer under the weight of a collective shadow. For too long, society has worshipped its good side, while burying the disowned darkness. That burial comes back in war, economic upheaval, racial divisions, intolerance, and the eruptions that dominate the headlines. The shadow has not vanished. It has simply dressed itself in global attire. We, individually and as a culture, will be asked to integrate it. The only choice is how, either consciously with awareness and dignity, or through destructive, unconscious behavior that corrodes us all. The danger of modern life is simple. The shadow is always seen as out there. We project it onto another person, another race, another group. And in doing so, not only do we wound others, we destroy the integrity of our own soul. Wholeness requires the shadow to return to where it belongs, into oneself. It is yours, and it carries a portion of your vitality. When two shadows collide, nothing is gained, only meaningless hostility. Both individuals remain possessed, unconscious, driven. To face the shadow of another without striking back, that is genius. Literature gives us one of the most striking examples, Goethe's Faust. Here we meet a scholar at the edge of despair, ready for suicide. At the moment of collapse, he encounters his shadow, Mephistopheles. What follows is not destruction but transformation. Faust discovers passion again, the spark of life. Even Mephistopheles, born of darkness, discovers something unexpected within himself, the capacity for love. That, finally, is the word that can hold the synthesis of ego and shadow, love. But here lies another paradox of the psyche. Sometimes we resist not only our shadow qualities, but also our nobility. We fear our greatness with as much intensity as our darkness. People shy away when you point out their hidden gold, resisting it with all their strength. That is why we prefer hero worship. The hero carries our gold for us. We dare not claim it for ourselves. Yet all of our psychic energy lies in these denied places, in both the darkness and the unused nobility. If we ignore our shadow, we become depleted, drained, sluggish in mind and soul. But when we confront it directly, When we sit with it and claim it as ours, then the opposite occurs. We discover energy, power, stamina. The shadow, once integrated, does not destroy us. It fuels us. It restores us for the work of living. Robert shares, "There was once a woman wise in her way who offered me a curious method for recovering energy when I confessed my exhaustion before giving lectures. She suggested I go into a private space shortly beforehand, dampen a towel so it grew heavy, then hurl it to the ground with full force, shouting as I did so. At first I felt utterly ridiculous, for such behavior was not consistent with the image I held of myself. And yet, when I stepped onto the platform afterwards, I was transformed. My eyes burned brighter, my voice carried with strength, and my body felt alive with stamina. The energy I had denied within myself returned, not to dominate me, but to stand silently at my back, supporting me." Here we touch on a profound psychological truth. The shadow carries vitality. Even a parrot, when exposed to language, repeats curses more easily than neutral phrases, not because it grasps their meaning, but because it intuits the intensity of emotional energy we invest in these words. Life, human or animal, responds not merely to content, but to the force with which experience is expressed. The unconscious listens not to subtle explanations, but to energy. In middle age, the constant swinging between extremes, the up and down of the inner seesaw, exhausts us. Yet, surprisingly, the middle place is not the lifeless compromise we once feared, but a field of richness, a place of renewal. To use the energy of the shadow properly is to open a door into a new season of life. This is where ritual becomes essential. A shadow ritual requires finding some content from the unconscious, something repressed or forbidden, allowing it expression in a way that both acknowledges it and prevents it from wounding the conscious personality. Symbolic acts, like writing out the shadow's words and burning the paper, carry immense transformative power. Ceremonies, whether ancient or personal, translate the chaos of the psyche into form, reminding us that all cultures have relied on ritual to metabolize shadow energy, whether through fasting, abstinence, sacrifice, or sacred celebration. For wholeness, one must hold both creation and destruction, good and evil, light and redemption together. Our longing for only the light blinds us. The greater vision of psychology insists on duality, that to meet reality honestly is to accept its shadowed counterpart. This is where the great paradox enters. Paradox is not contradiction. It is the creative tension of opposites. The myths of world traditions remind us the treasure lies precisely where we do not wish to look. Avoidance only binds us to contradiction, which yields despair and meaninglessness. Meaning sustains us through suffering, but suffering without meaning becomes unbearable. Contradiction destroys, while paradox brings forth new life. To embrace paradox is to embrace reality, including its disorder and mystery. Every experience reveals itself as paradox. Day only defines itself against night. Masculine makes sense only alongside feminine. Effort and rest give each other meaning. Even joy cannot exist without its sober counterpart. Paradox alone shifts us beyond quarrels into unity. That leap from contradiction to paradox is a leap of consciousness itself, one that carries us through the disruptive storms of midlife, toward clarity and wider vision in later years. Winning and losing, fasting and feasting, earning and giving, none are enemies, but complementary truths of human nature. To live is to inhabit contradiction. To grow is to reconcile it. And here lies the great psychological question: what is one to do with contradiction? Mishandled contradiction paralyzes the psyche, leaving one frozen in neurotic suffering. We neither move forward nor rest, caught in an agony of inertia. Kierkegaard identified this state in what he called the aesthetic life, a restless quest for pleasure that inevitably collapses into despair. He describes with sharp irony the one who cannot ride, cannot walk, cannot lie down, because each option bears its own futility. This can't be bothered. Posture is despair itself. Yet Kierkegaard insists, as psychology too affirms, that paradox is the only way forward, by way of the leap, whether it be into God, into faith, or into deeper consciousness. The error that underlies so much human suffering is our rigid dichotomy between sacred and profane, holy and unholy. To split reality this way is to misuse language itself. When we do, we divide what must belong together. Religion and deep psychology serve the same end at their core, to reconcile what we have torn apart in our perception, to build bridges between contradictions, to transmute opposition into paradox. It is here, in this reconciliation, that the suffering of dissociation softens into wholeness. Let us pause for a moment and reflect on the words of William Blake, the poet who reminded us of an essential truth, that within us lie both the luminous and the shadowed dimensions of the self. He suggested that the form we seek may belong to heaven, while the raw energy we need may arise from hell, and that the act of healing requires us not to exile one for the sake of the other, but to allow them to enter into union. For most individuals, life becomes an unconscious struggle to hold down this internal war of opposites, protecting one side while rejecting the other. Yet such a life spent in conflict yields nothing but exhaustion and despair. The paradox, however, appears as a miracle. It is worthy to win, but it is equally worthy to lose. It is right to attain, and just as right to go without. Both carry truth. To remain faithful to this paradox is to step toward integrity and wholeness. On the other hand, when one clings fanatically to only one half of reality, the result is rigidity. Fanaticism becomes a feverish attempt to silence what has been denied, while pretending that only one voice should be heard. The result is narrowness, brittle certainty, and the precarious mask of always being right. Now let us ask, what has paradox to do with the shadow? In truth, everything, for paradox cannot exist in its healing fullness until the shadow has been acknowledged and drawn closer with dignity. To resist the shadow is to remain divided. To own it is to lay the foundation for authentic spiritual encounter. Conflict, when faced consciously, opens into paradox. Paradox, embraced fully, becomes revelation. This is the rhythm of the psyche's growth. Notice how often one stands caught between duty and desire, whether to meet the disciplined task at hand or to linger in reverie, delaying action. The truth is, neither posture is sacred by itself. The sacred emerges only in the tension between them, in the paradox that grants each its place. It is precisely in those moments of hopeless conflict, moments where every path feels blocked, that individuation announces itself. This is the beginning of self-realization, the unconscious holding the ego against the wall, forcing the recognition that neither choice, as it stands, is entirely right. The ego must admit its limits, and this humble recognition opens the doorway to something greater than the personal will, something larger than I. Here is where perspective shifts from ego control to soul vision. Symbols guide us here. The mandorla, that timeless circle of wholeness, testifies to the unity of the self. It is not merely a design, it is a mirror for one's deepest nature and a reminder of our kinship with all life. In the Tibetan tradition, for example, a teacher may give a mandala to a student, not as decoration, but as sacred instruction, asking meditation upon its form for years until the student is prepared for the next step in awakening. Alongside the mandala is another symbol less familiar and yet profoundly relevant: the mandala. Unlike the full circle, the mandala appears where two circles overlap, forming an almond-shaped space. It speaks of reconciliation, the place where opposites meet without one destroying the other. Visionary art often sets Christ or the Virgin within this space, for Christ himself embodies the union of divine and human. He is the archetype of opposites reconciled, the path that leads us out of duality and into unity. Reflect then on those times when life has pushed you to the edge of despair, when discipline falters, when strength itself no longer holds back the contradictions of existence. It is in such moments that the mandorla becomes essential. Healing does not come from clinging only to the light, nor from surrendering to the dark. It rises in the touching point between them, where their edges meet and form something greater than either alone. The deepest spiritual experience emerges precisely at that intersection. We often comfort ourselves with tales of good's triumph over evil. Yet the deeper wisdom is otherwise, that good and evil cease to be enemies when they are seen as two aspects of one whole. When one recognizes oneself as belonging equally to heaven and to earth, the illusion of two circles dissolves, and one realizes there has only ever been one circle all along. This is the mystery at the heart of Christian fulfillment, where duality gives way to wholeness and illusion to truth. Consider this as well: when one creates the mandorla within the privacy of the inner life, its effect resonates far beyond, as though heard for 1,000 miles. Jung was often asked about humanity's future, especially under the shadow of great upheavals. His answer was neither despair nor reassurance, but an invitation. If enough people will do their inner work, for to integrate the shadow is to contribute less projection to the world's collective darkness, and thus to lessen war, division, and strife. In this way, inner healing is never purely individual. It is also a contribution to the healing of the collective. And from this inner reconciliation emerges the mandorla, the sacred overlap, the doorway of wholeness, the true prize of consciousness. And so, as T.S. Eliot once envisioned, the fire and the rose are one. Fire, the symbol of transformation, and rose, the symbol of renewal, overlap each other to form a mandorla. In this truth we discover not opposition, but unity, the paradox resolved, the soul restored. And it is at that deepest level of being that we are reminded the transformative fire of suffering and the blossoming flower of rebirth are not separate at all, but halves of the one life to which we all belong. To recognize and embrace the shadow within oneself is not a trivial or poetic notion. It is a profound psychological and spiritual undertaking. This work of reconciliation brings a sense of wholeness, which in turn becomes a sacred experience, arguably the deepest and most transformative encounter of a human lifetime. Robert A. Johnson, known widely as both an American author and a dedicated Jungian analyst, lived as a student of Carl Jung's analytical psychology. His life path was largely shaped by an early and traumatic encounter with mortality. At the age of 11, Robert survived a devastating car accident that brought him to the very threshold of existence. In that liminal space between life and death, amidst the blackness and silence, he encountered what he described as an ecstatic dimension, a golden radiance that revealed itself through visions. When he was revived and the visions ceased, the abrupt return left him in despair. He longed for the beauty and transcendence of that inner experience, and initially felt he could not go on living. Therapy proved crucial. It restored his willingness to remain alive, reminding him that his capacity to witness such experiences depended on his human existence itself. From early on, Robert wrestled with life in the outer world. He often felt out of place, and even carried the archetypal association of Parsifal, the innocent wanderer, or the naive fool. Death and life touched him repeatedly through fragile, almost invisible threads, yet his dedication to the inner world became a source of guidance, strength, and survival. His eventual meeting with Carl Jung marked a moment of decisive orientation. Johnson later reflected on Jung's instruction with deep reverence. Jung urged him to protect solitude, to reserve a personal space solely dedicated to inner work, and to remain free of social collectives or organizations. Jung emphasized that the unconscious itself would provide what Robert required, and that his only sacred task was to tend to his inner life. Outer achievements, Jung insisted, were secondary to this deeper obligation to foster the unfolding of the collective unconscious through authentic inner work. For Robert, this directive became a guiding principle, yet life's path continued to challenge him. At the age of 54, in a period of profound confusion and uncertainty, Robert made an unaccompanied journey to India. This pilgrimage tested him. He arrived weary, displaced, and even without his luggage. Longing for rest, he turned toward the hotel window, where, unexpectedly, a moment of renewal occurred. There again appeared before him the vision of the golden world he had once seen as a boy, an image luminous with sacred vitality. He understood this as a gift, a rare second chance to live tethered to the inner vision that had never truly left him. The lesson that Robert drew, and one which psychology affirms, is that the inner world is trustworthy if we cultivate faith in it. The golden world is never lost. It is always present as a dimension of consciousness itself. It does not need to be fabricated, earned, or postponed to another realm. Rather, it waits quietly, accessible here and now to anyone capable of opening their perception. Such is the deeper psychological meaning behind the scriptural teaching. The kingdom of heaven is within. Through his writings, including He, Understanding Masculine Psychology, She, Understanding Feminine Psychology, and Owning Your Own Shadow, Understanding the Dark Side of the Psyche, Johnson offered a path of reflection and guidance. In this exploration, our focus turns particularly toward his study of the shadow. The modern individual, he suggests, will not find the waters of life in the external world, but in the depths of inner reality. To truly live, one must move beyond the surface identity of the ego, the narrow band of what we know and manage consciously, and turn toward the shadow. Jung's early insight defined the shadow precisely as that which exists outside of awareness, the unknown, unacknowledged, and repressed facets of the psyche. Johnson's work continually draws us back to this truth, that engaging with the shadow is not only a psychological task, but an existential and spiritual necessity. The shadow. There are countless misunderstandings surrounding what we call the shadow. Far too often, it is labeled as something evil, sinister, or dangerous, something one should avoid at all costs. Yet, this is a distortion. The shadow is not some external demon, nor a detached entity that seeks to corrupt us. Rather, it is an inseparable part of who we are. To reject it is to reject ourselves, and in doing so, we fracture our own being. All of us walk with a shadow, both in the literal sense and, more importantly, in the psychological one. It functions as a mirror image, a side of the self that we cannot directly perceive. But it is not merely absence. It carries the qualities we lack, the traits that complete our wholeness. The shadow compensates what our conscious self does not yet acknowledge. For example, the shadow of a criminal is not further cruelty or violence, but sincerity, tenderness, and genuine connection. Likewise, the shadow of a timid and anxious person is courage, accountability, and assertive presence. When we present only the polished and acceptable fragments of our personalities, the pleasant mask designed to gain approval or avoid conflict, we inevitably repress emotions and refuse authentic feelings. That denied energy does not disappear. It sinks into the shadow, builds resentment, and eventually projects outward, usually onto others, without our awareness. To live fully, we must face the reality that each of us contains both the capacity for good and the potential for darkness. Refusing one is to split the self in half. And so, our deepest longing for peace, goodness, and happiness cannot be fulfilled by denying the shadow. It is not the enemy. It is, paradoxically, our hidden ally, containing an untapped reservoir of gold waiting for discovery. But when it is neglected, when it is misunderstood, the shadow turns disruptive. It will act out, take control, and guide life unconsciously. In this sense, you either integrate the shadow and be guided by it with awareness, or you resist it and are dragged by it, often into neurosis. True transcendence does not come from goodness alone, but from the union of opposites, the full embrace of light and dark within the self. Where does the shadow come from? It emerges from qualities within us that we have deemed unacceptable. These traits do not simply vanish, they sink into the hidden chambers of the psyche until they form what we call the shadow life. And when this denied energy outgrows the control of the ego, it bursts forth, often as rage, despair, or uncontrollable impulses. Jung once asked, "How do you find your shadow?" and answered with a metaphor, "How do you find the dragon that has swallowed you?" By definition, the shadow is the part of you that remains unconscious, unseen. If you are able to openly speak of it, then it has already come into awareness and ceased to be shadow. More often, it is those around us who perceive our shadow first, a truth that is uncomfortable yet humbling. At birth, each of us is innately whole, but culture does not allow wholeness. It permits only fragments, restricting certain expressions while rewarding others. Thus, the personality divides: the acceptable self we call the ego, and the exiled self we call the shadow. This is the legacy of becoming self-aware, of eating from the metaphorical tree of knowledge that split good from evil. In that sense, the shadow has even been equated with sin, while the self represents the potential for redemption. Yet culture, with its leveling demands, buries not only what is dark, but also much of the gold within us. As Robert once observed, strangely enough, people often resist the noble qualities of their shadow far more fiercely than their darker ones. It is easier to confront the skeleton in the closet than to allow oneself to recognize the treasure buried there. To own one's shortcomings is difficult, but to realize one's hidden greatness may be even more terrifying. Indeed, many will only uncover this inner gold when confronted by crisis, illness, suffering, even the brush with mortality. Such experiences awaken what was dormant, showing us parts of ourselves we had long abandoned. This is the spirit of the wounded healer, the one who first cures themselves by discovering the gold within pain, and then carries that wisdom outward like medicine for the community. By adulthood, the ego and shadow are firmly structured. We live within systems of right and wrong, yet the greater psychological task, often mirrored in religion, is to reintegrate what has been divided. Religion, at its root, means to bind together again, to reassemble what has been fractured. That is the real spiritual labor. For modern people, this feels daunting, because it implies something larger than the ego must take precedence, and the ego resists this fiercely. Yet true healing asks for a kind of death, not the death of the physical body, but the softening, the surrender, and the transcendence of the ego's dominance. Let us begin with an observation from Robert. He suggests that the first half of life is usually spent immersed in the cultural process. We learn, we adapt, we acquire skills, we form families, and we impose structure and discipline upon ourselves in countless ways. Yet, as the years unfold, the second half of life reveals a different task, not accumulation but integration. It becomes a movement toward restoring wholeness, toward a kind of psychological holiness that allows us to reclaim balance within. Robert proposes a helpful metaphor, the seesaw or teeter-totter, as a mirror for our personality. On one side, the righteous or socially acceptable qualities gather. On the other side, sit the forbidden, rejected, or shadow aspects of ourselves. It is crucial to recognize here, no quality ever vanishes. None can be eliminated entirely. They shift in weight from one side to another, but they always remain part of the structure. The deeper truth is that a governing law of balance is always present, though most of us overlook it. For stability of psyche, each indulgence or emphasis on the right-hand side of virtue must be counterweighted by an equal pull from the hidden or shadow side. The pattern works both ways, and this explains why sudden mood swings occur, why at moments one feels overtly virtuous, while at other times uncharacteristically reckless. It is the psyche searching equilibrium. But when the seesaw is weighted too heavily for too long, when balance shatters, there is risk of collapse. At that breaking point, what we call psychosis or nervous breakdown emerges. Just as we take the regulation of the body's temperature for granted, we forget too easily that the mind lives within its own dynamic principle of balance. A medieval image helps expand this understanding. In one manuscript of the Tree of Knowledge, the tree grows from the very navel of Adam. On the left, the Virgin Mary, clothed in monastic dress, plucks the fruit and distributes it to penitents seeking salvation. To the right, Eve, naked, plucks from the same tree and hands fruit to a line of people bound for their undoing. Notice one tree, yet two streams, salvation and damnation, generated from the same root. This duality mirrors the creative process itself. Every act of creation bears with it seeds of destruction. Though we might crave creativity without its shadow, vitality without consequence, such a possibility does not exist. Resistance to this truth runs deep. Most people cling instead to the fantasy that goodness is found by leaning as far as possible onto the light side of the seesaw. But to tip that way is to court collapse. The sacred point is the center, where both sides maintain weight. This does not mean we parade our shadow openly before the world. Society often demands concealment, but concealing it from oneself is the true danger. Robert emphasizes, yes, we will have a shadow. Even Augustine cried out, to act is already to sin, implying that creation and destruction are inseparably tied. To bring forth light is in the same breath to cast darkness. Ancient India teaches this as well. Brahma, the creator, Shiva, the destroyer, and Vishnu, seated in the center, holding the opposites together. There is no human existence exempt from shadow, but the task is to live with this awareness and to express the darker energies in intelligent and conscious ways, rather than in denial or projection. The dance of light and dark can be endured and even embraced. Here lies one of Jung's most significant contributions. Ego and shadow arise from the same source, counterbalancing one another perfectly. Light cannot exist without shadow, and shadow cannot exist without light. To acknowledge and accept this truth leads us toward what Jung calls the holy place within the center of being, the wholeness that cannot be accessed by rejecting parts of ourselves. Failure to undertake this task is not just personal avoidance. It represents failing one's own calling, missing the deeper purpose of existence. The path, then, is not perfection, but completeness. The aim of psychic growth is not to polish away flaws or live in one-sided goodness, for that brings only fragility. Instead, it is to embrace the totality of human experience, our light and darkness, our virtues and imperfections, our strength and our vulnerability. In that embrace grows the real joy of being alive. Wholeness, not purity, is the source of vitality and meaning.